I wanted to go back and talk about some stuff that I talked about in the second episode of the Sparkcast, where I was talking about that fever dream of that prediction that I've had about Canada's political system running into a brick wall. Basically, what I was predicting was that my core prediction was that Poilievre wins a minority, and then a center-left coalition, which includes the Liberals, the Bloc, the NDP, and the Greens, block him. And then the Poilievre base basically freaks out. Some bad political violence type thing starts happening. Poilievre doesn't properly denounce it. He gets ejected, and then another more moderate figure who comes in to rebrand the Conservatives, someone like Doug Ford, eventually steps in. And I don't think that this is some wild sci-fi script. It's something that I've been talking about for a couple of years now. It's just like a extrapolation of the contradictions that have been brewing over the past few years in Canadian politics. And I think it's entirely possible because the Conservatives are leading in some polls, but their numbers are very soft. We've seen them drop what looked like an absolute sure thing majority to what is now a coin flip. And that's because Poilievre's base is a mix of far-right reactionaries and disaffected suburbanites who don't really understand what they're signing up for with him. And as soon as that contradiction starts playing out, when the socially liberal Conservatives realize that they're accidentally electing a more conservative, more far-right, neo-libertarian Bitcoin freak who pals around with very problematic people, I feel like those numbers are going to slip even further. Then the other thing in all of this is that the Bloc Québécois holding the balance of power within all of this isn't completely insane either, because the Liberals, they were in trouble, but they're on the upturn. The NDP has been just completely irrelevant throughout this whole process. And if Poilievre ends up somehow winning a minority without picking up much in Quebec because of a surge from the Bloc in Quebec, I feel like the Bloc could very well end up holding the balance of power. Even if the Conservatives win a minority, they would hold the balance of power because they would be able to form a coalition, which would benefit the Bloc Québécois immensely. But even also if the Liberals win a minority, because they would be able to prod at the Liberals with the chance of voting against them, similar to what's happening right now, which again, for the Bloc, it ends up very much benefiting them. So yeah, that would put the Conservatives in a position where they would technically have won the most seats, but they can't govern effectively because nobody outside of their party would be willing to support them. And again, in the Canada parliamentary system, that means that they don't get to govern at all. And this is the part that gets really funny, in my opinion, because people who don't follow Canada politics, especially Poilievre's base, fundamentally misunderstand how the Westminster political system works. They think it's just whoever gets the most seats wins, and it's not, right? It's about who can actually form government that has enough votes to survive a confidence motion. And if Poilievre wins a minority, but every other party refuses to work with him, he's done. He doesn't get to govern just because he has the most seats. He has to actually secure a governing majority. And if the Liberals, NDP, Greens, and Bloc agree to work together, they would just lock him out, right? And that's going to trigger an absolute meltdown. The convoy people, the anti-vaxxers, the guys who think Klaus Schwab is microchipping the world, they're all going to completely lose their minds. They're all going to see this as an illegitimate legislative coup, something along those lines. And because they just have absolutely no idea how our own political system functions. And they're going to genuinely believe that Poilievre won and then was like, quote unquote, removed, and that some like deep state maneuver took him out, when obviously the reality is that he just lost a basic parliamentary math, and that this movement is going to be like Convoy 2.0, and that's going to be the scenario that shakes out. Obviously, the first convoy was a joke, a bunch of people in F-150s doing donuts in Ottawa calling for a revolution, but the next one will not be, right? The next one will be angrier, because this time they'll feel like their guy actually won before it was stolen. Poilievre becomes the victim of this parliamentary maneuver. His most deranged supporters are going to react like Trump's did in 2020, and it's going to be Canada's version of January 6th, except instead of storming the Capitol, it'll be something even stupider, like trying to block Parliament Hill. And this is what will kill Poilievre. This is what's going to, he's not going to be able to distance himself from this, and he's built his entire base around this type of sentiment, and these will be be his foot soldiers, and he won't be able to turn around and say, no, actually, I respect the process. He's either going to get consumed by this outrage or disavow them, which will make him lose his momentum completely. Either way, he's going to be done if this hypothetical second convoy January 6th type event happens. And the backlash for this would be deeply swift, and the conservatives would have no choice but to cut him loose. He would either resign or get pushed out, and then suddenly they would be scrambling for a new leader. And again, Doug Ford is the natural successor because he's what the Conservative Party would actually need to be, like a right-wing moderate party that appeals to those soft conservative. Ford is that guy for people who vote liberal federally and conservative provincially. He's that populist, old school, common sense, common man politician who plays dumb while selling people out to developers and to neoliberal capitalism. But most importantly, that's the thing, is that he isn't Poilievre, right? So he doesn't scare centrist conservative. He's a guy that they can sell to the suburbs. He isn't ranting about Bitcoin or hanging out with problematic conspiracy theorist type people. He isn't turning every press conference into a weird confrontation. He's got a little bit more savviness, political savviness than Poilievre. So again, this is where I see it would be like Ford taking over, and suddenly the conservatives would look a lot better than they did under Poilievre, than they did under Scheer, or whatever other clown that they had. And obviously Ford is a clown too, but I'm just talking about like the palatability of these clowns. It would be understood as like a calculated, disciplined, capable of winning elections type leadership. And that's when they would make their real comeback, in my opinion. And with Carney is very much this weird case because he's the perfect embodiment of this moment, as what I'm talking about, of this moment of crisis, this moment of negotiation, because he's a technocrat, he's a neoliberal fixer, he's the kind of person that people would look to when they just want things to be stable. He isn't doing anything inspiring. He has no political project besides the stability of the system. He's in no way radical, but he looks to be a responsible adult in the room. And that's all he really needs to be. If the choice is between a coalition of liberals and moderate conservatives, or a party that has just failed to put together any response to Donald Trump, voters are going to be able to take the safe bet that is Carney. And that's the thing. This is a huge thing too. And this is what people need to understand, is that Carney does not need to win a majority. There's not even a chance that they need to win a majority here. They need to either keep the opposition, keep the conservatives to a minority, or hold themselves to the minority that they have, right? He just needs 33% of the vote, essentially, to be in a governing position of any type. And this is why it's so much easier in Canada than in the US. Like, he doesn't need to convince half the country to like him. He just needs to hold together a fragile coalition long enough to keep the conservatives out of power. But here's the thing, is that coalition would not last very long. It doesn't. Like, depending on how it shakes out, if the liberals were to win a minority, it would not last long. The government would there would be a shift very quickly. Maybe not immediately, but in a year or two tops, because the bloc would eventually either demand too much or demand just enough from the conservatives to get what they want. The NDP, depending on their stature as a party after this next election, either way, they're going to have a lot of frustration with both sides. The Greens, they don't really matter, but they'll probably contribute to this mess in some small petty way, because that's just how Elizabeth May is. Because eventually cracks form, the center falls in, and there will be another election. And then by then, this is tying into the theory I was just talking about, because Ford will have likely fully rebranded the conservatives into something that will actually appeal to a broader audience. That's when the real victory happens for the conservatives, because that's when the conservatives come back as this more moderate voice that isn't tainted with an international embarrassment like Pierre Poilievre. It's got this statesman like Doug Ford, right? And that's what I envision here. And the whole process, I think, is going to be very funny. And it sounds a little bit disjointed, but in my mind, it makes a whole lot of sense, because Poilievre wins a minority, or he doesn't win a majority and gets blocked. His supporters freak out. A crisis happens. He gets thrown out in response to it. Ford steps in. Carney runs basically a caretaker government, and then that coalition falls apart over a small amount of time. By then, the Conservatives have rebranded under this more moderate Ford type of politics. And then that's when the real consolidation happens under the Conservatives. And it's this disjointed but very logical sequence of events where, given where all things are right now, I think it's very likely. And the funniest part, I think that Poilievre never even comes close to actually being prime minister, which is just so funny because he's going to be the guy who gets blocked, the guy who just lost his own party, the guy who just lets the dumbest supporters sink his career. And in the end, the Conservatives, they will still come to power, but it won't be with him. It's going to be with someone else.